Years ago, a woman in the wheat country of central Kansas disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a half-finished cup of coffee on her kitchen table, a set of keys still hanging in her front door, and a 4-year-old daughter who would spend the next 3.5 decades not knowing where her mother was buried. The man who killed her knew exactly where she was. He knew because he put her there. He knew because he owned the land. And in the years that followed, as investigators searched and the family grieved and the community held its breath, and then slowly, quietly exhaled and moved on, he did something that no one who drove past it every day ever thought to question. He built a road across that land. He gave the road a name, and the name he chose was hers. For 35 years, her name stood on a Greene County road sign above the place where she lay. That is not a story about a killer who got careless. That is a story about a killer so certain of his own safety that he could afford to memorialize the woman he murdered. Could afford, in fact, to make her name a permanent fixture of the landscape he controlled, and trust that no one would ever understand what the sign meant. What he did not account for was that the land would eventually be sold, and the people who bought it wanted to build. But before we get to what they found, we have to go back to Harlan County, Kansas, in the spring of 1988. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Diane Louise Cavett was. It was April in the High Plains, and the winter wheat was coming in green across the fields east of the county seat. In Harlan Falls, Kansas, population just under 4,000, spring arrived not with warmth, but with wind, the kind of sustained, direction-shifting wind that rattles storm windows and tips the trash cans at the end of driveways and reminds you, every year, that you live on a plain that goes uninterrupted all the way to the horizon. People in Harlan Falls liked it anyway. They liked it because they knew it, and it was theirs. Diane Cavett was 38 years old. She was 5'6", with dark red hair she kept short. And she had lived in Harlan Falls her whole life, except for 4 years at Kansas State in Manhattan, where she had studied agricultural business and met a man named Robert Cavett, whom she had married in 1979 and divorced in 1985. She worked as a loan officer at the Harlan County Farm Credit Office on Main Street, which in 1988 meant she spent her days helping farming families navigate the wreckage of the farm crisis, the foreclosures, the restructured debts, the men who came in wearing their good shirts and could barely speak. She was not gentle about it the way people sometimes are when they mean to be condescending. She was direct and precise, and she found every legitimate option in the paperwork, and the farmers who worked with her knew the difference. She had a daughter named Cassie, 4 years old, who stayed with Diane's mother, a woman named Irene Cavett, during the workday. Diane picked Cassie up every evening at 5:30. They had a routine. On the drive home, Cassie told her about the day, and Diane listened without interrupting, because Cassie was 4 and 4-year-olds need to be listened to completely or they stop talking. She lived in a 1-story house on Sycamore Lane, 7 minutes from her mother's. She drove a 1985 Chevy pickup, dark green. She had a small vegetable garden in the back that she started from seed every March on her kitchen windowsill. She had a man in her life named Roy Stiegel. Roy Stiegel was 44 years old and owned a significant amount of land on the eastern edge of Harlan County, which he used partly for farming and partly for a small residential development he had been building out since the early 1980s. Modest houses on half-acre lots. The kind of development that small Kansas counties were seeing a lot of in that decade. He was on the County Planning Commission. He was on the school board. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in the weekly paper regularly and pleasantly. The kind of man who stood up at public meetings and spoke with the fluency of someone who had never doubted his right to be heard. He and Diane had been seeing each other for 8 months. People at the farm credit office knew about it. Irene Cavett knew about it. She had told Diane's sister that she wasn't sure about Roy Stiegel. She couldn't have said exactly why. On the morning of Friday, April 22, 1988, Diane did not come to pick up Cassie. Irene waited until 6. Then she called the farm credit office. They said Diane had left at 5 o'clock as usual. She called the house. No answer. She drove over. The lights were off. The green pickup was in the driveway. The front door had the keys still in it. On the kitchen table, a half-finished cup of coffee. Irene Cavett called the sheriff's department at 7:15 that evening. She stood in her daughter's kitchen with the phone cord twisted around her hand and told them that Diane was gone and something was wrong. She knew something was wrong. She said, "You have to send someone tonight." They sent someone that night. Sheriff Earl Madden opened the investigation the following morning. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no signs of a struggle inside the house. There was the coffee cup, which suggested Diane had been home, had made coffee, and had then left or been taken, quickly, with no time or warning to do anything about the keys she had left in the door. The investigation turned immediately and logically to Roy Stiegel. He was the person closest to her. He was interviewed within 24 hours. He said he had not seen Diane that evening. He had been at a planning commission meeting, he said, from 4:30 until nearly 7, and then he had gone home. 3 other commission members confirmed the meeting. It had run long. Someone remembered him leaving at about 10 past 7. The farm credit office was 3 minutes from Diane's house. She had left at 5. Whatever had happened in a window. Roy Stiegel's confirmed presence at the meeting covered most of that window. It didn't cover all of it, but covering most of a window, in 1988, in a county with limited resources and no physical evidence linking a specific person to a specific location, was enough to make the case difficult. The search lasted 11 days. Volunteers covered the county roads. The highway patrol assisted. A dive team checked 2 ponds on the eastern edge of the county. They did not find Diane Cavett. They did not find her because she was not where anyone thought to look. She was on Roy Stiegel's land, on a section of the eastern development parcel that, in April of 1988, had not yet been graded for construction. A flat stretch of buffalo grass and red dirt at the back edge of the property, screened from the county road by a stand of eastern red cedars that Stiegel had planted along the fence line 4 years before. Nobody searched that land because Roy Stiegel had an alibi for most of the window. And nobody searched it because Roy Stiegel had not been charged. And Roy Stiegel's land was Roy Stiegel's land. In 1991, the case went cold. By 1995, 7 years had passed. Irene Cavett still lived in the same house where she had waited for Diane to call. Cassie was 11 years old and lived there with her. Robert Cavett had signed over custody without a fight, and she was a quiet child who got excellent grades and who did not talk about her mother to people she didn't know. When teachers asked about her family, she said she lived with her grandmother. Diane's sister, a woman named Patty, had moved to Wichita in 1990. She came back to Harlan Falls 3 or 4 times a year and always drove past Roy Stiegel's development on the eastern edge of the county when she did. She did not know why she did this. It was not on the way to anywhere she was going. Roy Stiegel, in those years, had completed his eastern development. He had graded the back parcel in the summer of 1989, 14 months after Diane disappeared, and run a road through it. The road connected the development's interior loop to a county access track along the fence line. It was a short road, barely a quarter-mile. Under the county's rural addressing system, it needed a name for the 911 database. Roy Stiegel gave it a name. He filed the paperwork with the county addressing office in October of 1989. He listed the road name on the form in his own handwriting. The county made a sign, green, reflective lettering on a standard post. They put it at the corner where the road met the access track. The name on the sign was Diane Lane. He told anyone who asked, and over the years a few people did, that it was a common name for a road. Nothing particular. He'd had a college girlfriend named Diane, he said once. It was a good name for a road. The sign stood for 34 years. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep doing that work, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop us a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely makes a difference to this channel. Now, let's get back to Harlan County. Because in 2022, Roy Stiegel sold the development. He was 78 years old by then, and the buyer was a regional construction firm out of Salina that was expanding the project, converting the back section of the property into a small commercial strip. They needed to regrade the back parcel. They had a survey done. They brought in an excavator. On the morning of August 9th, 2022, at a depth of approximately 4 feet below grade, along the western edge of the road known as Diane Lane, the excavator operator stopped the machine and climbed out and called his foreman. The foreman called the construction company's office. The construction company called the Harlan County Sheriff. The remains were identified through dental records in 6 days. Diane Louise Cavett, 38 years old, missing since April 22, 1988. She had been there for 34 years, in the ground beneath the road that carried her name, 7 feet from the signpost. Sheriff Linda Garza, the third sheriff to hold that office since the case went cold, called Irene Cavett on a Tuesday afternoon in August of 2022. Irene was 81 years old. She said very little during the call. When the sheriff was done, Irene thanked her and said she needed to call her granddaughter, and she would call back. Cassie Cavett was 38 years old, the same age her mother had been when she died. She was a middle school science teacher in Lawrence. She had driven past Diane Lane twice in her life without knowing what it was. When her grandmother called her, she pulled her car to the side of the road and sat there with the phone in her lap for a long time. The investigation that followed moved quickly, because 34 years had not erased the evidence. It had, in some ways, preserved it. The burial had been deliberate and deep enough that it had remained undisturbed. Forensic anthropology established the manner of death. Soil analysis established the timeline of interment as consistent with 1988. A forensic archaeology team mapped the site precisely. And on the ground, 4 feet down, beneath the layers of gravel and grade fill that Roy Stiegel had laid over the road in 1989, investigators found something that connected the burial not just to the land, but to the man who had prepared it. Records show that the gravel used to surface Diane Lane in October of 1989 came from a single supplier, a quarry 20 miles east of the county seat that kept detailed delivery logs. The delivery to Roy Stiegel's development in October 1989 was logged. The quantity, the date, the destination parcel, and the name of the person who had signed for it. Roy Stiegel had signed for the gravel himself. He had not hired a contractor to surface that road. He had ordered the gravel, arranged the delivery, and overseen the work. He had been there when the road was laid over the ground where Diane Cavett was buried. The arrest warrant was signed on September 14, 2022. Two Harlan County deputies drove to the house Roy Stiegel had retired to on the western side of town. A different house from the one he had lived in when Diane disappeared. A newer house, a larger one. He was 78 years old. He was on his back porch when they arrived, reading a newspaper, in a lawn chair, in the September light. He said nothing when they read the warrant. He looked at the deputies for a long time. Then he looked away, toward the fields at the edge of his property, and he said, "I should have sold that land years ago." He was charged with first-degree murder. He was taken into custody. The community of Harlan Falls, which had watched Roy Stiegel attend planning meetings and school board sessions and county fairs for 3.5 decades, which had driven past his development and his roads and his signs without knowing what lay beneath them, received the news of his arrest the way communities receive the news of a betrayal that was always, in some wordless way, suspected, not with surprise exactly, but with a specific and clarifying fury. The fury of finally having a name for the gravity. Patty drove from Wichita that night. She drove past the development. She drove slowly down the access track to the corner where the county sign still stood, because nobody had taken it down yet, and she sat with her headlights on it for a while. She did not get out of the car. She did not need to. At the time of this video, Roy Stiegel had entered a not guilty plea. He remained in custody. The trial date had been set. His statement at the time of arrest, "I should have sold that land years ago," was expected to be presented to the jury. The county addressing office removed Diane Lane from the 911 database in October of 2022. The sign came down the same week. What the county decides to call that road going forward had not been determined at the time this was recorded. Cassie Cavett told a reporter that she didn't have a recommendation for what to call it. She said what she wanted was for her daughter, who was 7 years old and had never known she had a great-grandmother named Diane, to grow up knowing her name. She said, "Not on a sign." In a story. Diane Cavett was 38 years old. She had a 4-year-old who needed to be listened to completely, or she would stop talking. She had seedlings on a kitchen windowsill every March. She had farmers who came in wearing their good shirts, and she found every legitimate option in the paperwork, every time. Because that was what the work required, and she understood that. She had a mother who knew something was wrong before anyone else admitted it was possible. There are killers who hide bodies and hope for chance and the passage of time. And then there is something rarer and more disturbing. A killer who is so confident in his own position, so certain of the architecture of his own respectability, that he can afford to do something theatrical with the fact of what he has done. Naming that road was not carelessness. It was not sentiment. It was the act of a man who believed, with total conviction, that he would never be found out, and who found, in that belief, a kind of leisure. A leisure dark enough to plant a sign and watch it stand for 34 years. What undid him was not a detective. It was not a database. It was not new technology or a witness who finally came forward. It was an excavator operator on a Tuesday morning who climbed out of his machine and looked at what the earth had kept. The earth kept it. That is worth sitting with. Justice moves at the speed of the ground, slowly, without announcement, resistant to being hurried, but it does not forget what is buried in it, and eventually, one way or another, the ground gives it back. Before this video ends, we want to know what you think. When Roy Stiegel named that road, do you believe he was hiding in plain sight deliberately? Was this arrogance? Or was it something else entirely? And what does this case say about what local power and respectability can conceal for decades in a small community? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is one of those cases that asks a harder question than most, and we want to hear how you answer it. Justice found Diane Louise Cavett after 35 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are in the description below. Thank you for being here.